Have you ever felt like you're just surviving day after day without really understanding why everything feels so empty? Why does it feel like, even with all our comfort and technology, your mind is becoming more fragile, anxious, restless, on the verge of collapse? Nietzsche, the visionary 19th century philosopher and psychologist, once warned, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." But what happens when that why disappears? Today, we're going to investigate a disturbing truth, how the absence of purpose may be silently destroying your mind, and why this invisible illness has become the hidden epidemic of our age, exactly as the great thinkers predicted more than a century ago. Every morning, billions of people wake up feeling that something essential is missing from their lives. Maybe they can't even put it into words, but it's like an invisible weight drains their energy, desire, and hope. It's not uncommon to find people who, even after achieving everything society sells as success, financial stability, material achievements, recognition, feel strangely disconnected, emptied, as if they're just carrying out tasks in a soulless routine. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, observing Europe's value decay in the 19th century, already warned of this existential risk. When one loses the why, all the hows become unbearable. In his day, the void was a result of religious collapse and the advance of rationalism. Today, the crisis is even greater, fueled by technology, by the velocity that consumes our critical thinking, and by countless micro-purposes competing for our attention at every moment. Carl Jung, the creator of analytical psychology, also saw purpose as fundamental to human mental health. What we do not confront in ourselves returns as fate. For Jung, the lack of meaning casts the individual into growing states of anxiety, inner fragmentation, isolation, and sometimes existential despair. His theory of archetypes argued that, without a deep connection to values and historical roots, humans get lost in superficial myths, the shadow of lost purpose becoming an invisible monster that haunts the modern mind. Is it possible that the true epidemic of our era is, deep down, the absence of reasons that connect the soul to the act of living? What if this emptiness isn't just a symptom of our time, but the result of centuries of crisis falling upon us like a dark legacy? Why are so many people afraid to look inside themselves and at the same time running away from confronting what could actually transform their lives? Several recent studies show that mental health is directly linked to the perception of personal purpose. Harvard researchers found that elderly patients with a strong sense of meaning had lower rates of depression, better outcomes in chronic disease treatment, and even a lower risk of dementia. Young people, on the other hand, experience alarming levels of anxiety and depression when they don't find direction in their lives. It's not enough to just acquire things, the journey has to make sense. The World Health Organization and research centers like the Mayo Clinic affirm that a lack of purpose is linked to increased substance abuse, social isolation, suicide, and even difficulties in developing healthy relationships. These findings have changed paradigms for psychologists and psychiatrists. It's no longer just about treating symptoms, but about reintegrating the individual into a larger narrative. How much of your well-being depends on what you do every day? Can you find meaning in your routine, or do you feel like you're just checking off boxes to get by? We live in an age of hyperconnection, breakneck speed, and everything now. Social media, smartphones, and algorithms surround us with continuous stimuli, an endless race for relevance, approval, or just distraction. And little room is left for silence, introspection, or an honest quest for meaning. In the past, life's meaning was often given by traditions, deep family roots, ancestral beliefs, living cultures. Nietzsche saw the Europe of his time collapsing at its foundations and warned, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But, as he sums up in The Gay Science, when one loses the meaning, every means become unbearable. For Nietzsche, this void resulted from the fragmentation of the great values that had guided civilization for centuries. Carl Jung, keenly aware of the impact of modernity on individuals, wrote, "The sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being." And he cautioned, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." This lack of an organizing center, an inner sense, pushes many people toward paths where suffering is inevitable. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, shaped by the horrors of totalitarianism, observed, "The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution." Her analysis suggests that without genuine collective purpose, even the biggest upheavals end up falling into routine banality. What has it been like for you to live in a time when ready-made meanings are constantly sold, and yet more and more people report feelings of emptiness, apathy, or even despair? What would the great thinkers of the past say upon seeing humanity today facing the same existential dilemmas, only now on an unprecedented scale? Carl Jung was explicit. Relationships are living alchemy, but they only flourish where there is self-knowledge. Without purpose, families become arenas of conflict. Couples get caught in cycles of accusation and blame. Parents and children feel like strangers in their own homes. Artwork, collective projects, all are attempts for humans to connect with their own essence. And when disconnected from authentic purpose, they become sources of frustration. Real-life stories illustrate this dynamic. Jonas, a 25-year-old, jumped from job to job, had a string of relationships, chased pleasures at parties, on trips, through social media. Nothing filled the emptiness. Through Jungian therapy, he realized he had been ignoring his passion for music, stifled since childhood by his family's expectations. Reconnecting with his true calling allowed for real transformation. He stopped chasing external validation and began to find meaning in every action, even in the small routines of daily life. What would you dare to risk if you knew you would be accepted for who you really are? Which voices have dictated your path in life, and which one is truly yours? Carl Jung saw the search for meaning and purpose as the essence of mental health and individuation. For him, someone without a deeper goal became an easy victim of unconscious forces, divided, lost in internal chaos. Jung said, "Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health." But he warned that the greatest difficulty is precisely when there's no reason to face challenges. He saw purpose as the guiding thread that leads us through suffering and the absurdity of existence, a kind of compass for the unconscious, capable of unifying inner opposites, integrating the shadow, organizing chaos. Not having a why leaves space for emptiness and its ghosts. Anxiety. Jung saw anxiety not just as a clinical symptom, but as the cry of a soul that has lost its way. Self-sabotage. The modern person, he said, doesn't realize they're at war with themselves, but with each postponed decision, each unclaimed choice, they reinforce their own inner labyrinth. Shadow work. Jung introduced the concept of the shadow, all that we reject in ourselves. When purpose is missing, the shadow takes over, appearing as sabotage, irrational fears, compulsions, even psychosomatic illnesses. The shadow is the personality you would rather not be. He warned that whenever we avoid seeking genuine meaning, we give more power to the dark side of psychic life. Alienation was also central to Jung's diagnosis. The greatest problem of our time is not being connected to what's essential for our soul. For Jung, losing contact with the inner guide of the search for meaning was losing contact with the very essence of life. What you resist persists. Nay, without purpose, we become pawns for collective impulses, propaganda, fashion, politics, manipulation. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. Thousands of people, even in supposedly successful environments, feel like strangers living someone else's life. Not uncommonly, they seek refuge in addictions, from phones to consumption, through distractions and self-deceit. Jung foresaw this in the early 20th century. The most intense suffering is caused by unresolved psychological problems. How many times do we run outward instead of diving into the source of our discomfort? And what price are we paying as a society and as individuals for neglecting the inner call Jung saw as the only path to real mental health and integration? Studies by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi reveal that people engaged in purposeful activities report more flow states, those moments of complete immersion where creativity, pleasure, and productivity become one phenomenon. In the hospital, doctors observe that patients with a clear vision for the future show better rates of recovery, healing, immune response, and adapt more quickly to physical limitations. Jung saw creativity as the expression of purpose. Only when we allow ourselves to create do we create ourselves. Creative block is often a sign of conflict between authentic desire and social repression. Painters who stop painting, writers who silence their voice, teachers who stop teaching, all get sick when they don't express genuine callings. Imagine a dammed river. With every ignored desire, every suffocated talent, another stone blocks the flow. Eventually, the soul's lake overflows into suffering, anxiety, or sometimes inexplicable physical symptoms. For Carl Jung, purpose is much more than a rational choice or outside-imposed goal. It's the result of a deep encounter with archetypes inhabiting the collective and personal unconscious. Individuation is the process by which the individual becomes who he is, realizing his wholeness. Meaning, then, is born when the person integrates and recognizes their inner parts, including the shadow. Jung explains that everyone shares ancestral roots, which, when ignored, produce an orphan soul. Without roots, there is no blossoming. Throughout history, communities, myths, traditions, and rituals served as bridges between the individual and the mystery of existence. Today, with these ties lost, we become uprooted, often without knowing why. Jung warned, "Who isn't connected to their own tradition and unconscious lives at the mercy of mass psychology?" His concept of archetypes, universal patterns of meaning, is key to understanding why purpose is so vital. The archetype is like an underground river that will irrigate our lives, whether we realize it or not. For Jung, seeking purpose means confronting the shadow, facing instincts, harmonizing opposing energies within. It's not about crafting a perfect life, but integrating the forces within us, channeling chaos and pain towards self-knowledge. Jung recognized, happiness is never found by directly aiming at it, but as a side effect of inner alignment. So meaning isn't in following outside formulas, but in listening to your own daemon's direction, that genuine impulse born in the deep silence of being. Someone who ignores personal traumas, fears, or desires ends up repeating sabotage patterns, getting sick, or living to please an image sold by the media. Jung warned, life asks to be lived, and when we ignore that, we're consumed by boredom and neurosis. If true meaning arises from the meeting of consciousness and unconscious, what have you stopped listening to in yourself? And to what extent is your search blocked by fears, expectations, or models that never truly belong to you? Communities become ill when both individual and collective purpose are ignored. Jung saw the modern world as a battlefield between unrecognized parts of the self and mass expectations. Cultural resistance movements, from punk to hip-hop, beatniks to existentialists, are desperate attempts to create meaning against the void imposed by the status quo. When crowds move only by fear, alienation, or the promise of immediate gain, intolerance grows, democracy weakens, empathy fades. The 20th century is full of examples: totalitarian regimes, wars, urban violence epidemics, existential crises of entire generations. Current example: Gen Z, marked by environmental crises, economic instability, and digital hyperexposure. seeks causes, environment justice, mental health, to restore meaning. Engaged influencers, activist collectives, and digital communities show that even amidst chaos, humans can invent new purposes, often confronting power and reinventing the future. Jung realized that when we ignore purpose, we activate the most primal and often destructive unconscious forces within us. In his studies of mythology and symbolism, he highlighted the inner beast, that animal, instinctive, wild part living in the depths of the psyche. The subconscious mind, or as I prefer, the unconscious, is like a dark forest. Ignoring it won't make the creatures inside disappear, Jung wrote. Without a real objective, our primitive impulses take charge, driving anxiety, anger, envy, sabotage, dependencies, and even emotional breakdowns. In shadow work, Jung warned, the shadow contains what we do not wish to see or accept. And the more we flee from it, the more it shows up as fate. When we don't face the shadow, fears, traumas, repressed desires, and internal contradictions, it manifests as self-destructive behavior, toxic relationships, or even deep existential crises. We are not victims of fate. We are, to a great extent, protagonists of the inner journey we neglect, Jung taught. This mental chaos isn't a punishment for him, but a call to awakening. The sense of life, when cultivated, becomes a light in this internal labyrinth. How can I be useful without being whole, he asked, and how can I be whole without integrating what I reject? Imagine the human mind as a cave full of passages. Without purpose, we wander lost, afraid to face what's in the shadows. But as we seek meaning, each step reveals a new path until we see the way out. Someone without genuine purpose begins to sabotage their own achievements, becomes easy prey to addictions, lives in fear of failure, resenting others' success and experiencing constant anxiety. Jung saw all this not as illness, but as the result of poor integration. Disease is the failure to adapt creatively to life. What shadows have you been avoiding, believing that just ignoring them will bring peace? And what if the true purpose is, first of all, the honest encounter with what lies below the surface of consciousness? Jung maintained that the deepest purpose arises from encountering mystery. He compared the unconscious to an inner temple, where archetypes of healing, wisdom, courage, and hope await recognition. Stories of patients transformed by spiritual experiences are common. People who faced near death and returned with a mission. Monks and shamans who report visions of integration with the cosmos. Artists who describe inspiration as a sacred encounter with the ineffable. For Jung, healthy spirituality integrates the human with the totality of existence, not as an escape from the world, but as purpose manifested in daily life. The total absence of this transcendent bond is a source of emptiness, repeated patterns, and deep alienation. Carl Jung did not see humans as isolated islands, but as part of a current of tradition, ancestry, myths, and shared values. Without roots, he said, the human mind dries up like a tree unable to blossom. What we don't confront in ourselves, we seek in others, Jung taught, referring directly to projection, a phenomenon that intensifies when we disconnect from our own history and the surrounding community. Ancient rites of passage, group celebrations, and storytelling once reintegrated individual purpose with group wholeness. Today, with communities fragmented by the digital world, many try to fill the belonging void with social networks, seeking only superficial reflections of real connection. Jung warned, the greatest social problems begin with unresolved individual dilemmas. In other words, the collective suffers when individuals are conflicted, without purpose, direction, deep ties. Jung considered historical repertoire a vital asset for psychic health. Tradition is the wisdom carried by the collective unconscious. Ignoring it means abandoning our deepest roots. For him, reconnecting with both personal and collective history is essential to fighting the sense of orphanhood and restoring lost meanings. The idea of intellectual resistance also appears in Jung's writings on shadow integration. He argued that, to exist authentically in times of crisis, it is necessary to gather people able to think against the crowd, maintaining autonomy amid pressure to conform. The fear of being rejected by the group is, almost always, the fear of being rejected by parts of oneself that haven't yet been accepted, he said, encouraging all to the hard work of self-acceptance and strengthening personal purpose. A young adult, in reconstructing the meaning of their own story, stops seeking validation in online groups and starts looking for real belonging in activities that demand presence, effort, and meaningful exchange. Jung saw this as the birth of true community. We are all connected by invisible threads that carry the story of all who came before us. Where is your community of resistance in the face of modern emptiness? And what roots have you cultivated to honor your own journey, no matter how difficult it has been? Psychological maturity, Jung says, is achieved in the slow process of becoming who you are. The tragedy of adulthood is forgetting the call of youth. Current psychologists show that the search for meaning rarely ends in youth. Middle-aged and elderly people often start late journeys of self-knowledge, changing careers, seeking new love, exploring the world, reconciling with family histories, reclaiming abandoned hobbies. A revised example, Selena's story, who at 62 returned to studying philosophy after retiring, shows how meaning acts as vitality. Selena relates that she feels more alive now, no longer afraid of making mistakes, no longer guilty about reinventing herself, and highlights that it's never too late to start your true path. Throughout this video, we have seen that the absence of purpose is more than individual pain. It is a collective phenomenon that threatens mental health, life's meaning, and the very fabric of society. Carl Jung dedicated his life to studying how wounds, traumas, and unconscious quests, when ignored, create a generation of people disconnected from their own daemon. That unique spark everyone carries, which, if cultivated, can light even the darkest times. Jung said, "There is no awakening without pain. Nothing grows in the shade of conformity." Thus, the journey toward purpose is marked by inner confrontation, the courage to face the shadow, the quest for integration, and the acceptance of one's own paradoxes. Meaning, on this path, is not an external reward, but a side effect of a life lived with honesty. In his words, vocation is a vital obsession. Either we follow it, or we live in exile. In other words, everyone carries within a calling. Ignoring it is giving up on authentic meaning, deepening the emptiness so many feel today. Historical roots, the search for belonging, and intellectual resistance are not just ways to face the modern world. They are bridges between humanity's collective story and each person's unique journey. Jung taught, only those who face the dragon of the unconscious can claim the treasure it guards. Labitul, only you can answer. Are you willing to face the absence of purpose, taking the risk and responsibility to look within? What parts of yourself have been refused on the altar of conformity? And what if the answer is less about seeking outward and more about deeply accepting who you have become? The video ends not with a ready-made answer, but with the call to a journey. May every viewer upon finishing feel within themselves the ancient breath of the daimon, the courage to own their own story, and enough reason to give meaning even to suffering. Carl Jung leaves us a legacy. The meaning of life is to become who you are. And maybe, after all, this is the only purpose capable of saving the mind from silent collapse and of rescuing what has always been essential: